So this is one of my favorite topics. I hope that it's a topic that you will enjoy studying. We've been looking at Bible and science issues in this course, and I think it's foundational, really, to our understanding of the whole Bible, our study of Genesis 1 through 11. And it's just great to think about the details of the text. I was really enjoying my study again the last few days in preparation for tonight. Well, here's the book that started it all. In fact, I was reading it last night before I went to bed, and there's so much in here. And I read it a long time ago, but it's really the book that started the biblical young earth creation movement, the Genesis flood. You're looking at a copy that says the 50th anniversary, which was in 2021. So thankful for John Whitcomb and Henry Morris. And this book really did catch the attention of the world. Uh, the evolutionary worldview since 1925 and the Scopes trial, especially in America, evolution was on the march, and just that whole dominant worldview that impacted all the sciences and just the humanities, and even stretched into liberal theology, an evolutionary worldview, just sort of permeated the world there in the 20th century, and really culminated in World War I and II, especially with Nazi Germany. And we'll talk about racism and how that impacted the whole evolutionary worldview, impacted Nazi Germany. But yeah, speaking of Nazi Germany, there's a new movie coming out this Thanksgiving called Bonhoeffer. If you haven't heard about that in the news, you really should go see that. And if you've never read the book by Eric Metaxas called Bonhoeffer, you've just got to read that book. He wrote two books that I really enjoy. He's such a great author. He wrote the book on Martin Luther, and he wrote Bonhoeffer. So if you're looking for some good nighttime reading, uh, just you'll be fascinated with the stories. I encourage you to get the book and read it. I know you got other things you got to read, but it's always good to have something fun to read too. So Dr. Henry Morris was involved with ICR, the Institute for Creation Research, was a professor of hydraulic engineering, chairman of the Department of Civil Engineering at the Virginia Polytechnic Institute, graduate of Rice University, University of Minnesota. Two of his books that I have in my library, and he wrote many books and many articles. This one right here is called The Biblical Basis for Modern Science. Biblical Basis for Modern Science. So that book was written 1984. And so he talked about the physical sciences, talked about the earth sciences and the life sciences. So he gets into some of these topics that we've been covering. Chapter 11, Overflowed with Water, is biblical geology. So flood geology was his specialty, and that was reflected in the book. It's also got a chapter on biblical biology, biblical anthropology. So some of the things that we're trying to do in this class. And then his commentary on Genesis, the Genesis record. It's an older commentary, but the subtitle is Scientific and Devotional Commentary on the Book of Beginnings. So again, what we see is Henry Morris dealing with Genesis 1 through 11, the details of the text, but also talking about science. So, bringing those two together is what we're trying to do in this course. Dr. John Whitcomb professor of Old Testament at Grace Theological Seminary in Winona Lake, Indiana. He taught my dad. My dad graduated with his Ph.D. from Grace. And actually, when I was a boy, I actually played with his boys. So it's pretty interesting looking at the pictures of their family. Didn't recognize them, but it's just interesting to think about that. So we'll look at some more books that he wrote, including The Early Earth and The World That Perished. But he taught Genesis 1 through 11 at Word of Life Canada for a number of years. And after he stepped down from that, I guess I was the one who followed in his footsteps and taught there Word of Life Canada for several years. And through my trip to the Grand Canyon, which I'll be sharing with you tonight, which I took in 2008, just was motivated after meeting many from Answers in Genesis, including Terry Mortensen and Andrew Snelling, to devote my life to a study of Genesis 1 through 11. And I had the opportunity to teach that course, not only in Canada, but also in South Korea and in Russia as well, and Africa. Well, one of the things I mentioned in the dissertation research class, the importance of finding resources and putting them in some type of a chronological sequence. So as you think about your dissertation and you have your bibliography, of course, you have your Trabian style bibliography with your last name of author first. Well, I encourage you, after you do that, to turn it into a chronological bibliography. So when I talk about chronological bibliography, I mean by date of publication. So that way you can read the books in order that influence your topic. So we mentioned the Genesis Flood, 1961. And then two of John Whitcomb's books that I also read, The Early Earth and The World That Perished. So I read those books, I believe, in college. So I was in college 1976 to 1980. Went to Cedarville College, which was a young earth, continues to be a young earth college. Stephen Austin, learned about him from the trip to the Grand Canyon 2008 and bought his book, The Grand Canyon Monument to Catastrophe, published in 1994. I really enjoy the writings of John Morris, the son of Henry Morris. And if you're going to get two books, in addition to what you have, I would recommend the Young Earth book. And the second one is called The Global Flood, filled with beautiful artwork, charts. This is the Young Earth. You should get this. Next book you should buy for your library would be this book. And then this book here, which I'll be referencing tonight, on the global flood. So this book here is sort of like the Genesis flood for the 21st century. So it's not as detailed as Andrew Snelling's book, Earth's Catastrophic Past, but I really like it a lot. I got to meet Tom Vail, the old man of the river, when I was in the Grand Canyon for over a week. And his book, Grand Canyon, A Different View, is a book you have to get if you go to the Grand Canyon. Very important book. Footprints in the Ash is about Mount St. Helens. Be talking about that tonight. And again, Tom Vail, if you go to the Grand Canyon, another book, Your Guide to the Grand Canyon. So you can do the rim tour, with Canyon Ministries, and you can also do the 4-day trip or the longer trip. For the more detailed book, you want Earth's Catastrophic Past by Andrew Snelling. That's a 2-volume work. Pretty detailed, but it's going to give you all the information you'll need in your study of this topic. For those interested in fossils, John Morris's book, The Fossil Record. That would be the third book. If you want the John Morris trilogy, start with the Young Earth, then the Global Flood, and then the Fossil Record. Amazing books. And after you get Andrew Snelling's book, you'd want Dr. Boyd and Dr. Snelling's book, Grappling with the Chronology of the Genesis Flood. So start with the Genesis Flood, and then go to Morris, and then Snelling, and then finally Boyd and Snelling here. That'd be my recommendation for reading. Anybody else have any recommended sources that you've read, maybe that aren't on the list? Well, if you come across anything, make sure you let me know and add it to the bibliography here. All right, let's start by talking about the early Earth. We talked about this already, but this sort of bring us up to speed as we talk about the creation week. And of course, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we say that that was the first part of the first day. God created the earth ex nihilo, out of nothing. That means he did not use any pre-existing materials. Hebrews 11:3 says, by faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God. The things which are seen are not made of things which are visible. So the early earth did not come from the sun. And we know from Genesis 1 verse 2 that the early earth was covered with water. It's actually covered with water for the first 2 days of the creation week, and is described as formless and void. That is, it was uninhabitable, and darkness covered the earth. And so the world was covered with water. And as Whitcomb says in The Early Earth, the first heaven, or the atmosphere, had neither vapor canopy nor clouds, and the waters were not yet lifted above the expanse. And he talks about a water vapor canopy theory, which he believes happened as a result of day 2 creation, separation of waters from waters. Says neither Genesis nor geology gives any support to the idea that Earth's primitive atmosphere consisted of ammonia, methane, hydrogen, and water. We talked about this when we talked about the origin of life, as the evolutionary theory of spontaneous generation of life requires. Says the early Earth would be viewed from outer space before the Great Flood was different from its present appearance, would have been more colorful than it is today. No cloud canopy to obscure the brilliant blue ocean, no white polar ice caps or reddish-brown desert region. There would have been thick green vegetation that covered almost all the land, even in the polar regions, because thick coal deposits have been discovered there in the mountains of Antarctica. Number 3, the continents were different in shape and location. Some regions now high above sea level were once under the ocean. Many Bible scholars believe there was only one great land mass, sometimes called Pangaea, surrounded by seas, because 2 of each kind of air-breathing animals walked to Noah's Ark. It is also possible that if there was more than one continent, that representatives of all the kinds of animals that would have been living on that continent where the ark was being constructed. Well, what about the mountains and the flood? We talk about pre-flood mountains and post-flood mountains. The pre-flood mountains were created by God on day 3, when he said, let the dry land appear. And they were not as high in elevation as the post-flood mountain ranges. So high mountain ranges like the Rocky Mountains in America, Appalachian Mountains in the East, the Andes Mountains, South America, Himalayan Mountains in Asia, did not exist in the pre-flood world. The high mountain ranges of today could never have been covered by a global flood. They're too high. So that means the pre-flood mountains, not high compared to the post-flood mountains. Mountains before the flood did not contain fossils. So when the dry land appeared in the formation of the pre-flood mountains, there would have been no fossils in those pre-flood mountains. But mountains today, even including Mount Everest, the highest mountain, contains billions of fossils, plants and animals rapidly buried in sedimentary rock layers, all a result of the global flood. Also, mountains before the flood probably were not covered with snow and ice. Before the flood, the Earth had a warm climate, even in the polar regions. So the snow and ice, the higher elevations of mountains, came as a result of climate change brought about by the global flood and indicated in the Noahic covenant, Genesis chapter 9. Now, as we look at the tenets of creation statement, we're again reminded that millions of years of history is really foundational to the evolutionary worldview. So with young Earth creation view, we deny that millions of years of history occurred before Adam and Eve. Therefore, we deny that the geological record of strata and fossils corresponds to long geological ages before man. We will talk about the geologic column tonight. We also deny the Big Bang and any other naturalistic theory of the origin and history of the universe. And we deny that the radiometric dating methods, which are claimed to give dates of millions of years, are trustworthy. So we question the reliability of radiometric dating. And we say that the dates that they come up with cannot be used to overthrow or disregard the biblical teaching on the age of the creation. So 2 weeks from today, we look at Genesis 5 genealogy, and then we'll look at Genesis 11. We will talk about whether those genealogies are open or closed, and we will look at an argument for them being closed, okay? Number 7, we affirm the days in Genesis do not correspond to the geologic ages. Again, 6 consecutive literal 24-hour days of creation. So we've talked about that already. And we denied that the days of creation are symbolic of long ages, or that millions of years can be placed between the days or before the 6 days of creation. That's the pre-creation chaos view, or the day age progressive creation views. We affirm the great flood described in Genesis 6 through 9 was an actual historic event, worldwide and global in extent, extremely catastrophic in its effect. So it produced most, but not all, the geological record of thousands of meters of strata, fossils that we see on the Earth's strata or surface today. So we deny that Noah's flood was limited to a localized region. Usually they talk about the flood in Mesopotamia, and they try to argue from the ruins of Ur 3, that there was a flood in Mesopotamia that must have been Noah's flood. So we do not believe that that is the case. And we also deny that the flood was peaceful, that it left no abiding geological evidence. Well, as we come to our text that we'll be looking at tonight, chapter 6:9 to 9:29, we're talking about the Toledot of Noah. We talked about this in our first class. So in this section of Genesis, we're going to learn about Noah, the ark, and the global flood. We also learn the reason for the global flood: violence and immorality in the world. We also see God's deliverance of Noah and his family, 2 of every kind of animal, in the ark that Noah built. After the flood, we have the Noahic covenant, and God promised to never send a global flood to judge the sinful world. The seal of that covenant is the rainbow. So this section of Genesis ends with the sin of Noah, which we'll cover in 2 weeks. Talk about the blessing of Shem and Japheth, the meaning of the curse of Canaan, and then we have the death of Noah. So Noah is one who spans the time before the flood and the time after the flood as well. So if you have your Bibles, let's go to Genesis. And let's start there. In Genesis 6, verse 9. This is the Toledot, the genealogy of Noah. It says he was a just man, perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. So we have 2 individuals that are mentioned in the pre-flood world that walked with God. We have Enoch, who's mentioned over in Genesis chapter 5 and verse 22. And we've got Noah, who walked with God. Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We're going to see their importance, especially we get to chapter 10 of Genesis, the Toledot of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, focusing on their descendants. We look at the structure of chapter 6, verses 11 and following, through chapter 8, verse 22. We find a chiastic structure, which is very interesting. We'll see the reason for the flood given in chapter 6, 11 through 13. And God resolves to destroy the morally corrupt human race. And then in the A prime, it says he resolved not to destroy humankind. Of course, this was after the flood. In B, he builds the ark according to God's instructions, chapter 6, 14 to 22. In B prime, he builds the altar. He's going to offer the sacrifices there. In C, the Lord commands Noah and his family to enter the ark, chapter 7, 1 through 9. C prime, God commands Noah and his family to leave the ark, chapter 8, 15 to 19. You have the beginning of the flood, chapter 7, 10 through 16. And D prime, we've got the earth is drying out, chapter 8, 6 through 14. The flood is on the earth, prevailing for 150 days, 5 months of 30 days each. And the statement is made, the waters cover the mountains. Again, an argument that the mountains could not be the height that we see today. Chapter 7, 17 to 24. And then E prime, the flood recedes for 150 days. All right, so you had 150 and 150, you got 300 days, and the whole event is going to last 371 days. So over a year, the year being 365 days, Noah and his family and the animals were on the ark. The center point is chapter 8, verse 1. God remembered Noah. That doesn't mean he forgot Noah, but it means that he's going to act on his behalf to bring about his deliverance. Questions or comments on what I've said so far before we move into the next section? Your thoughts or comments?
I was just thinking we talk about the mountains, like the high mountains that are today are probably not before the flood. Um, but then we also talk about fossils on those mountains, like those mountain rises. Is that what we say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're going to talk about catastrophic plate tectonics as an explanation for the origin of mountains after the flood. That would include the Himalaya Mountains, Rocky Mountains, but it would include the Himalaya Mountains. We think about different plates like the India plate slamming into the Asia plate, and the buckling of that would have formed the um, Himalaya Mountains, including Mount Everest. Yes.
I have photos of newspaper articles of giant clams on top of Mount Andes. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, this is this whole issue of mountains. The question is, how do evolutionists explain this? Because these are, um, marine fossils, which you would expect if that area was underwater. So how do you explain marine fossils at the highest heights of these very tall mountains? I think it's over 29,000 feet from Mount Everest. So why the flood? Why would God destroy the world with a global flood with water? Well, we're told here in Genesis 6, 11 to 13, it says the earth was corrupt before God. The earth was filled with violence. God looked upon the earth, it was corrupt. All flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me. The earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So, more than once, God says the earth was morally corrupt and the earth was filled with violence. So, the two reasons for the flood, actually, the word corrupt means to spoil or ruin. It's used in Exodus 32:7. It says, God, that Israel had corrupted themselves when Moses was on Mount Sinai receiving the Ten Commandments. So, what did the Israelites do? Well, they made an idol, the golden calf, and they worshiped the idol by offering sacrifices to it, and they became involved in immorality. It says they rose up to play. So moral corruption, we could say, is idolatry plus immorality. Idolatry plus immorality. And we have another example of that in Romans chapter 1. So as we think about what Jesus talked about as it was in the days of Noah, so will be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. We look at what's going on in our society today, and we see moral corruption, the acceptance of adultery and premarital sex, multiple partners, transgender and same-sex marriage, all of these things and all the idolatry in our society. We have a society just like the days of Noah. Deuteronomy 4:25, God said he would judge Israel if they acted corruptly and made a carved image in the form of anything and did evil in the sight of the Lord. That's Deuteronomy 4:25. And the word corrupt is used in Judges 2:19 to describe how Israel behaved when the judge died and they turned to following idols. So moral corruption and violence, people were killing each other. Well, now we have the construction of the ark. In chapter 6, 14 through 22, God said, make an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, covered it inside and outside with pitch. So the question is, what did the ark look like? What do you think?
Probably looked like a box, in my estimation. Just designed to float nicely, but probably not to navigate. Yeah, so that's my guess. Big, long box.
Well, there's the old picture of the ark. Looks more box-like than the Ark Encounter, if you've been to the Ark Encounter. So you see the series of windows at the top. As we read the instructions here, that box-like boat covered inside and outside with pitch. Why?
Waterproof.
Waterproof. That's right, to seal it from any leaks, right? So the dimensions of the ark, 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. So the question is, what is a cubit? Apparently there were different views on the size of the cubit, but most said it was from the end of your elbow to the tip of your finger, that was a cubit. And so most say the boat was 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. So it had a roof and a series of windows, 3 decks with rooms, enough to house all the kinds of animals, 2 of every kind. So the volume of space was equal to 522 railroad cars. So if you've ever been at a railroad junction and watched the cars go by, you imagine 522 cars, right? That's a lot. Well, that's the old view of the ark. And Ham and answers in Genesis, as you know, involved in the building of the Ark Encounter. And there's the model of the Ark. They actually have a DVD and a small book talking about why they designed the Ark this way. And there's the Ark Encounter with the door here on the side. So the construction of the Ark. Would be like a modern ocean-going tanker. The ark was covered inside and out with pitch to make the ark watertight, seal it against leaks. And we told you the dimensions. Had a roof on the top, series of small windows that would let in air and light. The 3 decks provide more than enough space for animals on the ark. So Henry Morris, in the Creation Research Society Quarterly, the ark, he said, in fact, tend to be lined up by the spectrum of hydrodynamic forces and currents in such a direction that its long axis would be parallel to the predominant direction of wave and current movement. Thus, it would act as a semi-streamlined body, and the net drag forces would usually be minimal in every way. The ark was designed with highly stable, admirably suited for its purpose of riding out the storms of the year of the Great Flood. So the question, how could Noah build the ark? How could he do it? Well, Ken Ham says the Bible does not tell us that Noah and his sons built the ark by themselves. Could have hired skilled laborers or his relatives, including Methuselah, who died in the year of the flood, Lamech. However, nothing indicates that they could not, or that they did not build the ark themselves in the time allotted. Most believe it was 120 years that he took to build that ark. That's a long time. Physical strength and mental processes of men in Noah's day were at least as great, maybe even superior to our own. We'll talk more about this in a couple of weeks. We'll talk about the genius of ancient men and women. They certainly would have efficient means for harvesting and cutting timber, shaping, transporting, erecting the massive beams and boards required. If 1 or 2 men today can erect a large home in just 12 weeks, how much more could 3 or 4 men do in a few years? Adam's descendants were making complex musical instruments, forging metal, building cities. Their tools, machines, and techniques were not primitive. That's a key point to make. So if you go inside the Ark Encounter, you see these different containers, and just remind you that they brought food on the Ark. Storage containers for that time. And then 2 of every kind of animal on the Ark. So another question, how could Noah fit all these animals on the Ark? Well, in the book, Noah's Ark, a feasibility study, creationist researcher John Woodmarap said at most 16,000 animals were all that were needed to preserve the various kinds that God brought into the ark. So the ark did not need to carry every kind of animal, nor did God command it. It carried only air-breathing, land-dwelling animals, creeping things, winged animals such as birds. Aquatic life include fish and whales. Amphibious creatures could have survived in sufficient numbers outside the ark. So this cuts down significantly the total number of animals needed to be on board. Really an amazing wood structure, the largest wood structure in the world, the Ark Encounter. Getting a little bit of an idea looking at the people there of the size of this boat. Really does take your breath away and you see it the first time. One door to enter. Has some really nice displays inside. One of my favorites. Well, we'll see that the Lord was the one who closed the door after they went in. They were inside the ark for a week, 7 days before it started to rain. So imagine the laughter, the mocking outside. And then the judgment came. So we want to look at the logbook of Noah, the chronology, specifically detailed for us in this count. So as we go through the log of Noah, you'll see specific times are mentioned, different things that were written down. So the question is, was this information preserved and later given to Moses, who wrote the book of Genesis? I believe that's a real possibility. Well, let's start by looking. The 10th day of the second month is mentioned in chapter 7, verse 6. Now, Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters were on the earth. Noah and his sons, his wife, his sons' wives, they went into the ark because of the waters of the flood. The clean animals, animals that were unclean, birds, everything that creeps on the earth, 2 by 2, they went into the ark. Verse 10, it came to pass after the 7 days that the waters of the flood were on the earth. So in the 600th year of Noah's life, the second month and the 17th day, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of the heaven were open, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. All right, so they went into the ark, 10th day of the second month. And if you look at the chronology in Genesis 5, if you hold to a closed chronology, Usher said the date of creation was 4004, and you have 1,656 years from creation. That leads to a date of 2348 for the year of the flood. So day 1 would be the 17th day of the second month. So that's the first day it began to rain, and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. So that leads the question, how could it rain 40 days and 40 nights? Where did all this water come from? So Moses mentioned 2 sources for the water. The fountains of the great deep were broken up. So there would have been volcanic explosions, earthquakes that led to the breakup of the great fountains of the deep. So give you an example. So if you've ever seen Old Faithful in Yellowstone, that shoots up water. I think it's every hour or every hour and a half or something. That's why it's called Old Faithful. So there's some type of geyser from an underwater source, right? The water is underground water that under pressure comes to the surface and is pushed up. So imagine if that was being done around the world with all the fountains of the great deep being broken up, those on the land surface as well as those under the water, would have produced much water in the atmosphere. So if you've ever gone to the Ark Encounter, you'll see a picture of that dramatically displayed. It also mentions the windows of the heaven were open. Of course, the windows of the heaven is a metaphor. So supernatural source of rain. The windows of the heaven could be, if you hold the water vapor canopy, that water source separated by the atmosphere, which Whitcomb believed was the expanse on day 2, that, remember, day 1 and 2, the world was covered with water. And then you had a separation of waters below and waters above the expanse. So if the expanse is the atmosphere, then you can understand if it rained 40 days and 40 nights, all that water that had been on the earth for the first 2 days of the creation week, half of it now surrounding the earth, creating some type of a warmer climate, then condensed in rain for 40 days. So then the earth again would be covered with water, just as it had been covered with water in the very first 2 days. So that would be one possible explanation for the water. Now, if you read Andrew Snelling's book, he says the expanse refers to outer space. So he does not hold to the water vapor canopy theory, which was held by Whitcomb and Morris. So the source of water then becomes mainly the breakup of the fountains of the deep, shooting their water up into the sky, and you will then see the rain going up into the sky and then coming back down in the form of rain. Questions, comments, thoughts on the different views of the source of the water for the flood?
Usually rain requires precipitation, right? So does that mean that there would have been a lot of volcanic activity with ash going up?
Yes.
Yeah. So the fountains of the deep, there's like geyser, like pressurized water that's going up, volcanic activity that's spewing particles up into the atmosphere, and then the vapor canopy coagulating and condensing and coming down as rain 40 days. So that means that we don't have that extra layer today.
No. So we'll talk about this, but the water that covered the earth, remember on day 3, God said, let the dry land appear. So the water ran off the dry land and you had one landmass, but the blowing of the wind will lead to the water running off the earth again. And so you have something similar after the flood event. And we'll talk about some more observations that Noah made here in these texts when he first sees the mountains, that the tops of these mountains are appearing during the time that the water's receding. And so you have the rising of the land again, the formation of post-flood mountains, and that would help explain how we would have fossils at the tops of some of the highest mountains, because again, all this land, the whole world was covered with water. couple more and we'll take a break. So Wickham says the waters that were above the atmospheric expanse, so that's how he defines expanse there, the firmament, fell to the earth in a never to be repeated universal rain to rejoin the earth's oceans for the first time since the second day of creation week. So that's his explanation in his book, The World That Perished. So the flood is on the earth for 40 days. And now we have the ark that's being lifted up on the surface of the ground. So the ark, which was on the ground, is now floating on the water. And Genesis 7, verse 19 says that all the high hills, the mountains under the whole heaven were covered. So again, we have this idea of the mountains being covered with water. And 15 cubits. So the mountains were covered up to that amount. So as the ark was buoyant and in the water, it would not be dragging on the tops of these mountains in any way, but there would be water between the bottom of the ark as it sank into the ocean waters and the tops of these mountains, so it would not be scraping the mountains in any way. So again, the destruction of the flood, as Genesis 7:23 says, God destroyed all living things on the face of the earth. Man, so we'll talk about how many people were killed, but thousands, possibly millions of people killed. And only 8 people, Noah, his wife, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their wives, 8 people on board the ark. Well, we'll look at this and we'll take our break. So at day 150, mentioned here in chapter 7, verse 24, and just take a look at that. The waters pervaded on the earth 150 days. So after the 150 days, we have God remembered Noah. So it doesn't mean that he forgot him, but we now see God begins to work on his behalf as he sends a wind to pass over the earth and the waters begin to subside. So we have 150 days, 5 months, prevailing water, and now we have the recession of the waters. So God sends this wind. He closes the fountains of the deep. The rain is not happening anymore. And so the waters recede to the point that the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. So it does say plural there. I put Mount Ararat, which many believe today is the possible location of the ark. Tallest mountain in Turkey, lies on the border between Turkey and Armenia, and it's 16,854 feet high. It is covered with snow and ice. I think it's a good place to stop with the ark resting on the mountains there. So we'll come back to get into more details of the text as we just continue to look at Noah's log and what happened after that. Okay, so I'll see you in about 5 minutes.
Dr. Gromacki,
Yes.
I realized the due date was yesterday for our paper, the assignments. I'll try to submit it sometime today for me.
Okay.
Just a little bit behind with that. Just want to do some final check, if that's okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, welcome back. We're looking at Noah's log here in chapter 7 and 8 of Genesis. And we have the ark resting on the mountains of Ararat. Now we come to Genesis 8, verse 5. The waters decreased continually until the 10th month. And in the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. So that's day 225 if you begin to add up all these days. So Noah could see through the windows of the ark the tops of the mountains. These would have been the post-flood mountains, the formation of these mountains, which we'll talk about, that were being formed. So the ark has come to rest, and Noah looks around. He can see tops of these mountains. And then we come to the day 265. So he waits 40 days. So that's a long time, over a month, after seeing the tops of the mountains before he opens the window of the ark. Chapter 8, verse 6, it came to pass at the end of the 40 days, he opened the window of the ark which he had made, and he sends out the raven. So there are two birds that are prominent here, the raven and the dove. So the raven is sent out first, and it's flying back and forth. And we're told in chapter 8, verse 7, he sent out the raven. It was going back to and fro until the waters had dried from the earth. So the raven never did come back to the ark. And most say that was because it found something that it could eat, possibly something that that was rotten or whatever, that was floating on the water. And so then we come to day 273, Noah sends out the dove. So he's actually going to send out the dove 3 times. The first time he sends it out, the dove comes back, and we're told in chapter 8, verses 8 and 9, he sent out for himself a dove to see if the waters had receded, and the dove found no resting place for the sole of its foot, so returned into the ark to him, because the waters were on the face of the whole earth. He put out his hand, he took her in, and drew her into the ark to himself. So Kyle and Dalish say, their commentary, the raven in seeking food settles upon every carcass it sees. The dove will only settle on what is dry and clean. So the dove returns to the ark. So he waits 7 more days, and he sends out the dove a second time. This time it returns with a freshly plucked olive leaf. So again, this is sort of a sign that the water is receded. And so this olive tree possibly is able to grow. And even underwater, there's that possibility. But since the tops of the mountains had been seen for some time, the dove obviously could have found something from a very young olive tree. And then the third time he sends out the dove, he waits 7 more days and sends out the dove. And this time the dove doesn't come back. So the raven was sent out once, never came back. The dove sent out 3 times, 2 times it did come back. And the third time it did not come back to the ark. There's a lot of details here, which I think reveal to us that this was some type of logbook that Noah must have kept. So now we come to chapter 8, verse 13. Came to pass in the 601st year. Remember, Noah was 600 years old when the flood came. Now it's 601. The first month, the first day of the month. So that's why it's 1-1 there, which is day 315. So he's going to remove the cover off the ark. He sees that the surface of the earth is dry, but he doesn't go out. They didn't leave the ark, even though he observes and sees that it's dry. Why didn't he go? Well, God didn't tell him to leave. So just as Noah and his family went onto the ark and waited 7 days before the flood came, that is, the rains. So now he sees the earth is dry, but he still doesn't leave the ark. And it's not going to be until 56 days later that he'll leave the ark. So that's quite a bit of time there. We'll come to chapter 8, verse 14. In the second month, the 27th day of the month, he says the earth was dried. Right, so again, observation. He's writing down his observations, different times. He's keeping a record. And so God tells him to leave the ark. Chapter 8, verses 15 through 17, God spoke to Noah, go out of the ark, you, your wife, your sons, and your wife's sons' wives with you. Bring with you everything of all flesh that is with you, birds, cattle, creeping things that creep on the earth, that they may abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. Again, sort of reminds us of the first instruction to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. And God will also indicate that in the Noahic covenant. So we're looking at day 371 now. So from beginning to end, the flood event, 371 days. And we're looking at chapter 7, verse 11 through chapter 8 and verse 14, or we could actually say to the end of verse 19 there. So I could change that. So how do we know the flood was a global event and not a local flood? Well, some arguments. Number one, the high mountains were all covered. The high mountains were all covered. That's important. The depth of the flood. And again, we say that Whitcomb says this in the Genesis flood book. Instead of constituting an objection to the universal flood concept, the rate of decline of the water level becomes a strong argument in its favor. If nothing could be seen but the tops of the mountains after the waters had subsided for 74 days, we are left with no other alternative than to conclude that the flood covered the whole world. That's the Genesis flood, page 7. So the depth of the flood and the destruction of the flood, every living thing wiped out by the flood, Genesis 7:21 through 23. Of course, if the flood was local, then not all of the animals or people would have been wiped out. It would have just been in that particular region. But the destruction of the flood is interesting as far as an argument for it being a global flood. The Noahic covenant promise, God promised to never judge the world with a global flood again. The sign is the rainbow. Of course, there have been many local floods, and just recently in America, of course, we had with the Hurricane Helene, the flooding in North Carolina, Florida, saw some devastation of what a flood waters could do. if the Noahic covenant referred to a local flood, that would be a promise that God has broken, right? Because we've seen many local floods around the world. Couple more things I need to add to the notes or to the PowerPoint. The necessity of building an ark. Noah would not have needed to build an ark if the flood was local. God could have just sent him to a different place. So the fact that he had to build a boat, strong argument for a global flood. Now we have the teaching of Jesus in Luke 17. Jesus says, as it was in the days of Noah, so will be in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. So Jesus believed in Noah, yes. He believed in the ark, yes. And he believed in a global destructive flood, yes. The flood came and destroyed them all. The writer to the Hebrews said, by faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen. Rain. So the question is, how was the world watered? Well, you have that mist that's mentioned in Genesis chapter 2. You have the rivers from Eden that are also mentioned as a source of water. But because he was warned of the global flood, he prepared or built an ark. And that faith demonstrated itself in works. And by that faith, he condemned the world, the unbelieving world. And he also became an heir of the righteousness according to faith. Well, Peter mentions the event in 3 different texts in his 2 epistles. He says the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah. So Noah was not only building the ark, but was a preacher of righteousness, we're told. So for 120 years, as he built the boat, he was also preaching about a coming judgment. And it says the ark was being prepared. 8 souls were saved through the water. In 2 Peter, he says, God did not spare the angels who sinned. We'll talk about that as an argument for the Genesis 6 sons of God view. Cast them down to hell, delivered them into chains of darkness, reserved for judgment. And God did not spare the ancient world. So he didn't spare the angels who sinned. And then secondly, he did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness. There it is. Bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly. All right, think about that. All the people that were in the world at that time were ungodly. All right, they were unbelievers. We already saw the reason for the flood, the moral corruption and the violence in the world. And it says they willfully forget, the scoffers in the last day, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, the earth standing out of water and in the water. Maybe a reference to Genesis 1:2. The world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. I think, again, a reference to the global flood in Genesis 6 through 8. Well, as we talk about the formation of the mountains again, we get into some geology. And we talk about plate tectonics. So the uniformitarians talk about continental drift. That is, over millions of years, the continents were formed. So in contrast to that, flood geologists talk about a continental sprint. And that it happened during the year of the flood, that Pangaea was broken up into these different plates, and then with the water receding off the land, you have the movement of these plates, one plate jamming into another, and that buckling effect producing the mountains. So you could illustrate that. If you wanted to try to illustrate that, get two pieces of carpet or two pieces, something that you could, bring together, and what happens? It comes up in the middle, right? So if you bring those two things together, you could illustrate that. So plate tectonics is the study of what we call the lithosphere, the outer portion of the Earth, consisting of the crust and part of the upper mantle. The lithosphere is divided into a dozen large plates. And these move and interact with each other. That's why we have earthquakes. The interaction of these plates causes the different earthquakes. So we have what we call the San Andreas Fault out there in California, right? We've got mountain ranges. We've got volcanic activity. We have ocean trenches deeper than the Grand Canyon. Many other features, geological features on our planet. So the continents and the ocean basins are moving. They're moving. And this is because of these plate movements, right? So notice this is from a secular geology website there. So the forming of continents after the global flood. So the pre-flood Pangaea, that one landmass, was divided into continents. And if you looked at, John Morris actually has a picture. I'll have to try to take a picture of that sometime, of how all the different continents at one time are all joined together. I sort of look at how Africa and South America were linked together. And so the whole thing was linked together, came apart because of the flood. And then as it came back together, different plates caused the mountain formation. So biblical geologists talk about catastrophic plate tectonics because the flood was viewed as a catastrophe, and they talk about continental sprint rather than drift. And so rather than a slow, gradual continental drift, we've got a quicker time frame for this happening. Questions or comments on the Noah's log there before we move, or some of the verses from the New Testament, which again referencing the Old Testament event there. You got Jesus, you got Peter, got the writer to the Hebrews mentioning Noah. So your thoughts on that before we talk about the search for Noah's Ark?
I have a question. So the water on the oceans and the sea, pre-flood and after the flood, are we saying that more water stayed there after the flood? That's why we see the Earth's geographical location is covered more with water after the flood.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation there, Joseph. And Also, with the deep ocean basins, to as the water, there's more water, of course, like in Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean. So those would be deep basins where the water would have collected as it came off of the land, and then the rising up of the land and the rising up even more of the mountains that were being formed. And so we're going to look at this, especially as it relates to the Grand Canyon here in a minute.
Okay.
But yeah, so I agree with you that if you have all the water of the, say, for instance, the first 2 days when the world was covered with water, remember God said, let the dry land appear on day 3. So if you have the condensation, if there was this water vapor canopy, and so then the world was covered with water again, you have to have the rising up of the land again. And you have to have water rushing off the land. And where does all this water go? Well, you're going to have to, it'd be like anything. If you have something you want to push down the ocean depths to make more room for that water that had been over on the land, and then the land is going to rise up higher. So then all that water that had been all over the land is now going to go down into the ocean.
Yeah. Thank you.
A quick question, if I may. You mentioned about plate tectonics. Would there have been plates that existed before the flood, or are they the result of the flood?
Really good question. If there were plates before the flood, then they were all sort of linked together. You know, I think that Whitcomb said it's possible there were continents before the flood, but he seemed to indicate that there was one landmass. I believe that if you go to the Creation Museum, the way they picture it there, one landmass that was broken up because of the flood, and that would be, the fountains of the great deep, the earthquakes and things like that. And then, so you would have these 12 plates. Then after the flood waters receding, then you have movement of the plates that some of them linking together like pieces of a puzzle. For instance, like if you say India was a plate and smashing into the Asia plate to form the Himalayan mountains, then it's like, pieces of a puzzle, coming together and buckling. And so you have some parts of the plates are divided by other parts. So what possibly was a link between Africa and South America, of course, you got the Atlantic Ocean between the two now.
That makes sense. Thank you very much.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the search for Noah's Ark. Again, if you're looking for a book, don't be put off by the childlike cover. But yeah, again, another book by John Morris. So he writes in this book about his journey to Mount Ararat. So I'm not going to take the time to go through all the different historical sightings, but there were some ancient historians, including Josephus, who mentions the Ark of Noah. He never said that he saw it himself, but he did quote Berosus, the Chaldean, who claimed that the ship was grounded in Armenia. The Quran itself claims that the ark came to rest upon a mountain. We have modern sightings. Dr. Perot in 1829 claimed to have seen ark artifacts there near the mountain. And the Armenian known George Hagopian claimed to have seen the Ark twice. Soldiers from Turkey in 1916 claimed to have seen the Ark. And others have also made the claim. So I don't think I have anything else on that, but let's just read what John Moore said, and then I'll show you the famous picture that he has in his book. So he says, I've journeyed 13 times to Ararat. That is a lot of times. And one time he went with the Apollo astronaut, Jim Irwin. He says, these trips have been met with danger, varying success in helping to narrow the field of search. Not only is the mountain high and treacherous, wild animals are there, intense storms, local bandits, government opposition have been very real impediments. In recent years, Kurdish insurgents have used the mountain as a staging ground for terrorism throughout Turkey, as well as nearby Syria and Iraq. So, not to be done by the faint of heart. He says the early expeditions were all on foot, with mountaineers doing their best to cover the huge mountain. Most of the efforts hoped for a visual sighting. Some used ground-penetrating sonar, ice-cutting equipment, infrared scanners, GPS positioning. Aircraft were permitted on some occasions, both fixed-wing and helicopter. Many more sites could be investigated from the air than on foot. The entire mountain has been photographed in stereo, yet without a confirmed sighting. So the problem is the mountain is covered with snow and ice. And the supposed sightings have been at a time when there's been very little rainfall, or a time when there's been a lot of ice melt that has led to those who claim to have been there at one time or another. 13 trips. John Morris talks about how he was struck by lightning, and he mentioned some of the other things that happened. 13 trips, he didn't find it. But he talks about the mysterious object, and I don't know if you can see this, but I'll try to put it up there. The question is, what is that object that was photographed? Is that the Ark? You see the picture there is called the Ahura Gorge, which some claim that the Ark was broken into, possibly part has gone down into the mountain in some way. He calls this the mystery photo on page 33 of his book. So, what is it if it's not the Ark? So I think it's interesting. That's the thing I enjoyed most, was reading about that. All right, now the fun part. Get to share about my adventure in the Grand Canyon. So in June of 2008, I traveled 187 miles down the Colorado River. And I was with 28 Bible teachers and creation scientists. Truly the adventure of my life. And Tom Vail, who wrote the book Grand Canyon, A Different View, was our leader. He started a ministry called Canyon Ministries. So every day he would say, let's go boating. So we put on our life jackets and we got into our boats with the Arizona River Runners, and we went on our trip. So Tom shared his testimony on this trip. See, Tom was an evolutionist for many years. He led hundreds of trips down the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. One day, a tourist shared the gospel with him, and Tom became a Christian. and a young Earth creationist and a flood geologist at that. So his story is in the book Grand Canyon, A Different View. So who's been to the Grand Canyon? Okay. Now, as you know, the Grand Canyon is an amazing place. 5 million visitors go there every year. Breathtaking beauty, one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. It's in northern Arizona. And one of the things that make it famous are all these different rock layers. We're going to talk about those here in a minute. So I mentioned that our trip was sponsored by Answers in Genesis. So there I am in the boat, and 2008. And we started at Lee's Ferry, and we went through the Marble Canyon and then the Grand Canyon. And so some of the highlights were seeing the rock strata. You know, we're about a mile down from the top rim of the canyon in the boats there, about a mile down. We got to see some Anasazi Indian ruins, saw a petrified log, the Red Wall Cavern, just some of the highlights. And so we camped out every night along the river. Of course, the rush of going through some of these rapids, some classified 4 and 5. So the higher the rating means the more you could die. So you're pretty much hanging on for dear life. So, you know, I'm not that good of a swimmer, so I was holding on for dear life going through those rapids. So we learned about the different rock layers in the Grand Canyon. So there was a guy named Belknap who wrote the Grand Canyon River Guide that we used as a guide as we went through. And we looked at the different rock layers. We recognize there's quite a few. And if you compare the rock layers in the Grand Canyon with some geology textbooks, you'll see how they try to correlate them in the geologic column. So these are just some of the different rock layers. The Kaibab, Toraweep, Coconino Sandstone, Hermit Formation, Supai Group, Redwall Limestone. So you see the different eras in the evolutionary time frame, and they link these to the different rock layers in the Grand Canyon. So we'll talk more about the Great Unconformity. And at the very bottom of the Grand Canyon, you have what they call the Vishnu schist and the Zoroaster granite. So supposedly the oldest rocks in the Grand Canyon. So just give you an idea of some of the different rocks and the different time frame on the far right, which relates to the geological column. And so you see at the very bottom there, the schist and the granite, the oldest rocks. And isn't it interesting they have, I think those are Hindu names, right? The Vishnu and Zoroaster. They put those Hindu names on there. And you have the great unconformity. We'll talk more about that. And you see the different groups and the different time frame. So you have the Kaibab limestone at the very top. So the oldest rocks are at the bottom, and the youngest rocks are at the top. But you're talking about a mile deep. So when you look at that diagram and then you look at the geologic column, you begin to understand how geologists are going to say that it took millions of years for the Grand Canyon to form. So what is the word that is used by geologists to explain that worldview?
Uniformitarianism?
That's right. Uniformitarianism is the big word. And it means what?
Slow, gradual, uniform settlement of sedimentary layers.
Uniform in the sense that it takes millions of years for the canyon to be formed. And most say it took at least 16 million years for the Colorado River to cut the Grand Canyon. So you've got millions of years for the formation of the rocks. And then you have at least 16 million years for, they say, the Colorado River to cut through all those rock layers and to be then at the very bottom of the Grand Canyon. So the question is, if that's how the uniformitarian geologists explain the Grand Canyon, is what about biblical creationists? How do we interpret all these rocks?
Yeah, we say that they were laid down rapidly and a large volume of water just cut right through.
Okay. Right. So we've got a totally different perspective on how the canyon was formed and how it was cut. So
and left a little trickle called the Colorado River.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing is that you can't really tell from this diagram, but you could tell from other pictures, is that there are so many side canyons in the Grand Canyon. So we would often stop at one location. We would take some major hikes into the side canyons. So the question is, how can you have all these side canyons? Because the Colorado River is going east to west, basically. And I think I have a map to show you that. So Belknap, who's a uniformitarian, says the dark contorted rocks of the inner gorge are the ancient, highly metamorphosed remains of older sedimentary and igneous rocks. How ancient? Well, some say the Vishnu schist was metamorphosed some 1.7 billion years ago. Presumably, the original rock was deposited as silt or fine sand a few hundred million years before that, during the Proterozoic era. Above the inner gorge is a thick sequence of flat-lying sedimentary rocks. So at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, you have the metamorphic rocks, and then you have the sedimentary rocks, which would be sandstone, limestone. Fossil plants and shells are found there in the sedimentary rocks. So fossils are found in the sedimentary rocks. And that, they say, was posited 295 million years ago. So most of the rocks that were younger than Paleozoic have been eroded away from the canyon rim. And then it goes through talking about the different periods. So uniformitarianism versus catastrophism. So we got two different views on geology. So Whitcomb and Morris saying the Genesis flood, the uniformitarian, the belief that existing physical processes acting essentially in the present are sufficient to account for all past changes. So what they say is the present is the key to the past. Present is the key to the past in the uniformitarian view. So the principle of uniformity in present processes is both scientific and scriptural, but it comes into conflict with biblical revelation when utilized to deny the possibility of past or future miraculous suspension or alteration of those processes by their creator. And we talked a little bit about this before when God created the earth. It looked old, but it was only day one. We have the appearance of age in the planet. We have that true for the trees when God created them on day 3. For the animals that were full grown, it looked like they had been in existence for some period of time, but they were only 1 day old. So catastrophism says a lot of water in a short period of time to help form the canyon. Uniformitarianism, a little water over millions of years, long period of time. So again, uniformitarians say the present is the key to the past. They would reject the Genesis flood. Interesting though, when you go to the museum at the Grand Canyon, they recognize that there are marine fossils throughout these sedimentary rock layers. And so they will say that at one time, the whole area was underwater. Yet they don't believe in a Genesis flood. So when it comes time for the sandstone, the Coconino sandstone, they say at one time, the whole area was covered with sand. That's how they explain that there was water that covered the area, but that was millions of years ago. And then there was another time when you had like a desert-like time. So that's how they're explaining the different rock layers. So we believe that biblical catastrophism, the global flood, says God has intervened in the normal physical processes of the universe, causing very significant changes. So we see that with creation, and we see that with the flood. Let's go back and talk about geology here. So the igneous rocks, the sedimentary rocks, and the metamorphic rocks. If you had a course in geology, which I had in college, talked about this. And I used to like to collect rocks. I used to think I was a geologist. So I would go out looking for rocks. So igneous rocks are formed as a result of cooling of molten rock. So below the surface, we have the magma. And so when the magma comes out in a volcano, we call that lava. So magma or lava is the mixture of elements that includes silica, iron, sodium, potassium. So when these elements crystallize or cool, they become igneous rocks. So some beautiful igneous rocks. So I don't know if you've ever seen obsidian, very beautiful black rock, very shiny. Got pumice, it's got lots of little holes in it. Granite, of course, we're familiar with granite. And basalt. Basalt would be black rocks. If you ever go to Israel and you go to Capernaum, you'll be surprised at the old ruins of Capernaum. It's all basalt rock. Now, the last time I was there, traveling on a bus going up from Capernaum up to Caesarea Maritima. Our guide said, look over to the right. You see all those rises? He says those were ancient volcanoes. Oh, it made sense now. Where did all that black basalt rock for Capernaum come from? Well, it came from those volcanoes, which came after the flood. We had a lot of volcanic activity, and we have evidence of that even at the Grand Canyon. But I thought that was very, very interesting. I'd never noticed that before. It all made sense. The first century synagogue where Jesus performed miracles, including exorcism, was made of black basalt rock. The home of Peter there in Capernaum, black basalt rock. So very interesting. The sedimentary rocks are famous because they contain the fossils. So I'll have to show you at the break. I'll show you some of my fossils. But you have sandstone, shale, limestone is probably the most famous for fossils. Now, the metamorphic rocks are rocks that are pressurized because of heat and pressure and chemical activity. They change. So you're familiar with the word metamorphosis, which means change. So metamorphism changes a pre-existing rock, the parent rock, into another type of rock, a metamorphic rock. So the deeper the rock is buried, the hotter it will get, more pressure. And so igneous rocks and sedimentary rocks and even metamorphic rocks will be metamorphosed, changed into metamorphic rock. So that could be quartzite, which comes from the sandstone, and slate, which comes from shale. Marble, which we value, metamorphic rock, comes from limestone. All right, so you have these different rocks that under pressure and heat are transformed. That's why they call them metamorphic rocks. So we talk about geology and the time of the geologic column. And so we have these different rock layers that have been identified in the Grand Canyon and then identified as the different time periods in Earth's history. So we call that the geologic column or the geological time scale. And so oftentimes the rock layers themselves then are identified in the time frame. And I showed you that in that previous chart. In the sedimentary rocks, there are certain types of fossils that they call index fossils. These are also called guide fossils or zone fossils. So the fossils, the index fossils, and the various sedimentary rocks are used to give dates to the different rock strata. And the rock strata, types of rocks, are then used in the geologic column. So we have a little bit of circular reasoning here. Well, young Earth geologists have different views on the geologic column. And this book here, The Geologic Column, Perspectives Within Diluvial Geology, diluvial word for flood geology. So got different views. Some believe that the geological column should be accepted as foundational for understanding the geology of planet Earth. But they would reject the chronology of the geologic column. They would say, we can use it to understand the history, but we should not try to identify the particular time and say millions of years. So they think it's helpful to identify the rock strata. Second approach, called recolonization, accepts the geological column. and seeks to understand the fossil and rock strata within a framework of biblical history with shorter time periods. So as they look at the different rocks, they try to identify those rocks in biblical history. A third, Cass Walker, Ord, holds to Walker's biblical geological model. So the sedimentary rocks in the Grand Canyon labeled as Precambrian, Paleozoic, Mesozoic strata are viewed by them as early flood rocks. The Cenozoic strata can be early flood, late flood, or post flood. So they're looking at the rocks and trying to determine where they would have been laid down during that year of the flood, before, after. Now, a fourth group says just throw the whole thing in the trash. Why? Because it's used by evolutionists to try to prove millions of years. So he said we need to start all over if we want to have an understanding of the geology. And so they say the geological column has too many assumptions of millions of years, evolution, continuity of depositional processes. And so these individuals say if the column rests on these presuppositions of evolution, deep time, and uniformitarianism, which are all inimical, means it's opposed to creationism, it has no meaningful role in creationist stratigraphy. All right, so then you have to make a decision. Where do you land on the spectrum? Can we use it? Should we throw it in the trash? We find some type of significance for it. So we hold to flood geology. So there's a connection, a link between young Earth creation and flood geology. And so we believe that the sedimentary rock layers that contain fossils were laid down as a result of the global flood. If that is the case, as we go down to the rocks at the bottom of the canyon, the schist and the granite, the metamorphic rocks, we would say that those rocks came as a result of day 3 of creation week. The oldest rocks in the Grand Canyon would have been formed as a result of the water rushing off the earth and the land rising at the beginning there of day 3. There are no fossils in the metamorphic rocks at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. So the sedimentary rock layers in the Grand Canyon, the first layer would be the Tapete sandstone. So one of the things that I'll be showing you as we take a break, we come back, the layers are flat. There is no sign of physical or chemical erosion between the rock layers. If there were millions of years, there should be lots of evidence in the rock layers of erosion, but there's not. In fact, in one area they call the Great Unconformity, they say there's millions of years between the layer of rock above the unconformity and the layer of rock below, but it's completely flat like a table. How can that be? Think about our roads today. Think about the potholes. We got several roads here filled with potholes. We wait patiently here in Kansas City and Belton and Raymore for the potholes to be filled, hoping that our tires don't blow out when they hit a pothole. But those potholes are the result of what? The erosion effects of water. Where do we see that? In those layers of rock in the Grand Canyon. We don't. There should be lots of potholes, lots of evidence of that if there's millions of years. Not there. Why? Those rock layers were laid down quickly, short period of time, not over millions of years. Okay, take a break, come back, pick up our geology lesson for this evening. We've got to get into Mount St. Helens and petrified forests and a few other things tonight. So we'll see you in 5 minutes. All right, well, welcome back as we wrap up our study of Genesis, the global flood, and geology. We're talking about the Grand Canyon, and we're going to talk about some evidence that the Grand Canyon was formed as a result of the global flood. And we said the Tapete sandstone was the first sedimentary rock layer. This is according to Andrew Snelling with Answers in Genesis, geologist. And so there I am touching that Tapete sandstone there in the Grand Canyon. That was a pretty special moment there. Getting to touch that, the first rock layer laid down by the flood. John Morris says this in the Young Earth book: if creation flood thinking is correct, and I believe it is, then great thicknesses of sediments were laid down early in the flood, and those near the top were laid down late in the flood, only months later. So we think about the land, you had water rushing off the land, right? And that would go from, as we're going to see, go from east to west, the same direction as the Colorado River, by the way. But we have the floodwaters sweeping over the land initially, sweeping sediments and forming sediments there. And then you have water rushing off the land as the land is rising. Tass Walker, quoted by Tom Vail in his book Grand Canyon, A Different View. He says, we've determined that the horizontal layers deposited in the first part of the flood while the waters were advancing. We can use the same approach with other parts of the canyon, such as the metamorphosed rocks at the bottom, which would be the creation rocks, day 3, pre-flood, or even early flood. The erosion surfaces at the top. It's amazing when you go to the Grand Canyon. If you know, it's like you can actually look for miles, no trees. That whole area swept clean. You can see, you can understand how a global flood would sweep it clean. There's no trees. It's just a one flat plain, and then you come to the Grand Canyon, a big ditch. It's just amazing to see that ditch in the middle of, it looks like a ditch in the desert, really is what it looks like. We've got evidence of lava flows from a volcano, which would be post-flood, and even the carving of the canyon itself, which I'm going to argue is both. It says flood recessive or post-flood. I think there's an argument for both being included. So biblical geology helps us to understand the rocks in the Grand Canyon. You go to Tass Walker's geology website, you should check that out online. Michael Ward says, comparing Walker's model to the geological column reveals several surprises. First, sedimentary rocks labeled Precambrian. Paleozoic, Mesozoic strata are early flood rocks. Second, the Cenozoic strata could be early flood, late flood, or post-flood, depending on their location. Particular fossil used to define the Cenozoic. Flood deposition is highly nonlinear with a large percentage of strata deposited early in the flood. So John Whitmore, who is a professor at Cedarville University, the oldest rocks in the Grand Canyon, the Precambrian schist granite, were made during the creation week. I think that's what we've been saying. The rocks at the very bottom of the canyon perhaps later modified most of the unfossiliferous Precambrian sedimentary rocks, overlie the igneous and metamorphic basement rocks. Many of these sedimentary rocks date between the creation week and the flood. Early in the flood, these rocks were tilted upwards and catastrophically eroded by the floodwaters, forming the erosional surface called the Great Unconformity. A thick boulder layer, the fossil record began the Cambrian Tapete sandstone, rests on this surface. So he said that that was the first sedimentary rocks laid down by the floodwaters. Andrew Snelling, talking geologist now. The inner gorge of the Grand Canyon, we find the metamorphic rocks. The schist and the granite date back to the time of creation week. So you see, I've quoted several biblical geologists. They are all in agreement. The sedimentary rocks without the fossils, they would predate the time of the flood. Why? Because it was the flood that formed these fossils. Sedimentary rock layers called the Grand Canyon supergroup include the Chuar group, Nankoweap, and the Unkar group. That was amazing. They can explain all the different rocks, possible time and relationship to the flood. I'm not going to read all this, but want you to see the Great Unconformity. You see the two different rock layers there, and no erosion between those rock layers. We call that the Great Unconformity. So there should be some erosion there. Use the illustration of the road again with the potholes. If there was millions of years, Stephen Austin, who wrote Grand Canyon, Monument to Catastrophe. Is there evidence for catastrophic erosion? Well, there are large boulders of quartzite that are above the Great Unconformity at the base of the Tapete sandstone. And so Padwick interpreted these as underwater debris flows. I'm not going to read all this here. I got to move on. So no slow and gradual erosion. So biblical account of the flood describes the water sweeping over the continents. So the waters, imagine the speed of water. I think we got a little bit of an idea of what that was like with Hurricane Helene. If you watched any of the news reports and you watch those floods, and some of those towns that were completely wiped out by the floodwaters. So you can imagine rocks, boulders being moved by the rushing water, transported long distances. So the waters, it said, were flowing continually. So you've got transport of substances, rocks, deposition of sediments. Would have been fast. Well, there's another argument for the flood, the bent rock layers in the Grand Canyon. So if you look carefully at the picture, those rock layers at the top, and then you have the same rock layer at the bottom near the Colorado River there. And you see the bending. Now, usually when rocks don't bend, rocks break, right? You can't bend a rock unless the sediments were laid down quickly and bent when they were soft. The only explanation. So rocks don't bend, rocks break. So these rocks, who are the same layer, must have been laid down quickly and then bent when they were soft. I'm not going to read that again. Here's another picture, and I'll explain it. The transcontinental rock layers. Within the Grand Canyon, we have rock layers that match the rock layers in the Appalachian Mountains. There are rock layers that match rock layers over in Europe. How did that happen? How did that happen? There's transcontinental rock layers. Well, it must have been a global flood because it wasn't just one area. You got the same type of rocks. Different continents. So as we look at the Grand Canyon, and worldview has been compared to wearing a pair of glasses, what do we see in the sedimentary rocks? We see rock layers containing dead things. We call those dead things fossils. We understand that death came as a result of sin. And so we believe that these layers were formed in the flood, post-fall global flood. Not pre-fall Genesis 1-2 deluge, called by the gap theory Lucifer's flood. If you read Arthur Custance, that was the explanation for many years before the writing of the Genesis flood. Because evolution was prominent and the belief that millions of years was true, Christians began to compromise, and they accepted millions of years. They just placed the millions of years between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 and said that the rock layers with fossils were a result of a previous world, those fossils from a previous world before Adam. Compromise led to the gap theory. So John Whitcomb says the Grand Canyon was formed after the flood. Spectacular exposures of flat-lying sedimentary rocks provide evidence of deluge deposition. There are thousands of square miles of horizontal strata, thousands of feet thick. By far the most reasonable way of accounting for them is in terms of relatively rapid deposition out of this sediment-laden water. Following the flood, the rocks were still soft. The Grand Canyons were scoured out as the waters rushed down the newly uplifted peneplains to the newly enlarged ocean basins. So Whitcomb in The World That Perished argues for the view that the Grand Canyon was formed from the receding floodwaters as they rushed down from the plains that were being uplifted. They would have gone from east to west, and eventually the result would be the waters would empty out into the Pacific Ocean. Geologist Stephen Austin, catastrophic drainage is involved in forming the Grand Canyon. It would be a relic feature formed from erosive processes operated at rates and scales far greater than today. Grand Canyon would be a static monument to the action of intense, ancient processes, not a dynamically evolving landform in equilibrium with slow, modern erosive processes. So he's arguing for what? Catastrophism, not uniformitarianism. Well, even the psalmist says this: God, you laid the foundations of the earth so that it should not be moved forever. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the voice of your thunder they hastened away. They went up over the mountains. They went down into the valleys to the place where you found for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass over that they may not return to cover the earth. That was the promise, right? Never again, God said it more than once, never again will the world be covered with water. And so he set a boundary, right? Boundary, those beach boundaries, right, around the world and the different land, that the water will not cover the whole earth again. So Austin, in his book, Grand Canyon Monument to Catastrophe, says the surface of the Colorado Plateau is a saucer, he says, saucer-shaped basin that he believes contained a giant post-flood lake, which formed behind the Kaibab upward. So he says that the lake would have occupied more than 30,000 square miles, containing 3,000 cubics of water. It would be like 3 times that of the size of Lake Michigan. All right, so if you had a huge lake, 3 times the size of Lake Michigan, lots and lots of water, a post-flood lake. So he believes that there was a breaching event that could be from an earthquake, some volcanic activity. So all that water that was in that post-flood lake quickly then scoured out the Grand Canyon. And so after all those sediments had been laid, we have a scouring event when that water broke through. And he uses the illustration of Mount St. Helens to argue his point. So with the eruption of Mount St. Helens, he says the valley of the North Fork of the Tuttle River was blocked by a dam of landslide, debris, and volcanic ash on May 18th, 1980. So the valley was unblocked by a mud flow on March 19th. So what happened as a result? The breaching event produced several canyons, some as high as 140 feet deep. Those canyons, if you look at the pictures, include sedimentary layers of strata. So if you go down the Colorado River and you come to this rock in the middle of the Colorado River, which is called Vulcan's Anvil, you know what's beyond that is the most dangerous falls in the Colorado River. So if you've got that far, you hope you can make it the rest of the way. So that black basalt rock came from a volcano that must have erupted along the rim of the Grand Canyon. There you're looking at it. It's called Vulcan's Throne, near the Colorado River. So that Vulcan's Anvil was like the plug in the volcano. So when it erupted, that piece of rock shot up into the air, went down into the river. And so you've got the igneous rocks that came from the lava of Vulcan's throne. So you have post-flood volcanic activity. After the Grand Canyon was cut, there's evidence of post-flood volcanic activity. Again, we came across the Vulcan's anvil. This rock is 20 feet out in the middle of the Colorado River. It's interesting, Vulcan, I always think live long and prosper, Vulcan. From Star Wars, you have to, I just like Star Wars when growing up. I like Spock.
Star Trek.
Yeah,
Star Trek.
Spock.
Yeah.
Spock.
Spock.
So
Star Trek.
he was from a place called Vulcan. So Vulcan is the name of the Roman god of fire and blacksmiths. So in the myth, Vulcan pounds metal in his volcano workshop, showering fire and molten rock out of his skylight. Vulcan's anvil is the cooled core of the lava vent. And so the shiny black basalt rock is a warning to river runners. You're coming next to what? Lava Falls. And you talk about a rush. Lava Falls is the most dangerous falls in the Colorado River. I don't think I'm going to go there, but there's a lot of problems with dating the rocks. I mean, Andrew Snelling got into an issue with the Park Service there at Grand Canyon because he was sampling different rocks and testing them and showing that they could not be millions of years old. So, let's talk about fossils. We got to get to, running out of time here. I got to get to Mount St. Helens, but talk about fossils. So Ken Ham defines fossils: billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Fossils aren't just found in America, they're found all over the world. Oh, I wanted to show you my fossils. I got two pretty cool fossils. So when I was down in Texas, I bought these. So this is a fossil leaf. That's pretty cool, isn't it? Out of rock there, a fossil leaf there in the rock. Yeah, but my favorite is my fossil fish. Yeah, that's my favorite. And of course, I always have to show my grandson my dinosaur bone. So I got a dinosaur bone. So these are my fossils that I keep here. And I did bring my piece of petrified wood, but I got a really nice piece of petrified wood too. So you've got the trilobites. You ever wonder what a trilobite looks like? They're fossil graveyards. Why are they graveyards? Well, they were sea creatures that were instantly killed by the sediments that buried them alive. You know about being buried alive? That's what happened to these sea creatures. And they sometimes talk about the Precambrian or Cambrian explosion. When you look at the trilobites, they're fully formed creatures. They're extinct. I'm not going to have time to read all that from Andrew Snelling. This is interesting, the polystrate fossil. We're going to talk about fossilized tree trunks in Yellowstone Park. And what's your observation about that polystrate fossil? Just give me your observations.
That was a tree that cut right through soft layers.
Do you think it grew there?
Nope.
Why
I think
not?
it landed there.
Why didn't it grow there?
It's impossible
Why?
to grow through, well, through layers, because
Yeah,
it's
yeah, you
cutting
can't do
through the
that.
layers. Yeah, it's cutting through the layers. It's
Yeah.
two different, yeah, two different mineral formations.
What else? Another observation. What's a tree look like usually?
For me, it looks
So
like it grew there because from the bottom we see bigger size and the top one small one. So it looks like it was standing there, and all these layers came over here.
it looks
Okay.
like that.
Somebody
Yeah.
else? Where's the roots?
There are no
Where's
roots.
where's the branches?
There are no branches.
If it grew there should be some roots and branches there.
Yeah.
This tree was swept along by the flood, and you know the way it landed, it's vertical. Now I'm going to show you some more vertical fossilized trees in Yellowstone Park here in a minute. But polystrate fossils are an argument against what? Well, can't be millions of years in those rock sediments. There's no way that tree is millions of years old. That somehow it grew through those different sediments. No, there's no way. All right, we got to get to Mount St. Helens. You ever seen the movie about the what happened?
Yeah, I
Mount
saw a
St.
documentary.
Helens?
Yeah.
You ever seen a documentary of this?
Yes.
So May 18th, 1980. Before your time, most of your time, I think.
I was in high school.
Mount St. Helens is in Washington State. You had a huge earthquake, and you had the eruption of Mount St. Helens. And what happened and what was recorded helps young Earth creationists in what way?
Mm.
What way does this help us?
To reconstruct the conditions of the flood and flood geology, and to make sense of things like the Grand Canyon that we just studied.
Mm-hmm. So what it does
And
becomes like a mini MINI laboratory of catastrophism. How something like this event happening in 1980 shaped the whole geography and geology of that region in such a dramatic way. So the earthquake was 5.1 on the Richter scale, and it shook the whole northern slope. And the magma that came and the seismic activity, there was a huge landslide. Combination of ice, water, debris, magma reaching speeds of 150 miles per hour, over 1,300 feet. The whole northern slope exploded over 230 square miles, surrounding area. Molten rock temperatures, 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit, exploded and blasted throughout the landscape. Well, I don't have some more pictures of that, so I should add to this. But let me talk about what was found. So I need to add to this. I'm sorry I didn't have the pictures, but the mud flows formed canyons very similar to the Grand Canyon. And that was very interesting, including rock layers. So rather than taking millions of years, those rock layers were formed in a very short period of time as a result of this catastrophe. There was a place called Spirit Lake, and mentioned in the book.
It was at the base of the mountain.
Yeah. So I'll show you some pictures from the book. Footprints in the ash. So see if I can show you this here. I don't know if you can see that or not, but that's all trees. All those trees that were along that mountain were snapped like twigs, and the debris and the water swept them down into Spirit Lake. So let me show you. Here's a picture of the canyon that was formed with the strata. Looks just like the Grand Canyon. The rapid sedimentation.
Like the
including
1/40th. 1/40th
Yes.
of the size of the Grand Canyon.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
I remember
so
from the documentary.
you see that? You have logs like that in the Spirit Lake. Some of
Sinking.
those logs
The bottom.
sank to the bottom of Spirit Lake. And guess what? When they sunk to the bottom, it looked like they grew down there. They were upright.
Yeah, upright. That makes sense because the bottom where all the roots would have been, the trunk, the bottom trunk would be heavier. So it would just kind of slowly sink down there.
If you go to Yellowstone, you'll see the petrified forests. That's petrified wood. Very similar to polystrate fossil we saw, similar to what we saw with the trees from Mount St. Helens swept into Spirit Lake, but they're made of rock. Petrification can happen very quickly in water as the minerals replace the different cells of the tree. Questions, comments before I finish with the Gilgamesh epic? Okay. You'll get more information. I wasn't able to read everything for you. But I've given you some resources if you want to pursue this. That's very interesting if you study these things, read about them, and then you actually go and observe it for yourself. So if you like to hike, like to travel out west, you can see some of these things. So what do you know about the Gilgamesh epic to finish tonight? What do you know?
There is some similarities to the biblical account.
Yep. So has anybody ever read it? So you should sometime read Gilgamesh epic, okay? So the Akkadian Gilgamesh epic was discovered by Austin Layard in the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh in 1849. So he had 12 cuneiform tablets. And so the translation was made by George Smith, and he was the one who, when he discovered this, I believe it was in the British Museum, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Yeah, it is.
That when he translated into English from the cuneiform, everybody was very, very excited. And so this was done in the 1870s. Why? Because there were similarities between the Gilgamesh epic and the Genesis flood narrative. So Gilgamesh epic is a poem, and Gilgamesh may have been a real historical person. In the Sumerian king list, Gilgamesh is listed as the first ruler of the dynasty of Uruk. And he's also described as being 2/3 God and 1/3 man. Now, that sort of sets us up for a couple of weeks from now when we talk about the sons of God and the daughters of men and the Nephilim. Okay, so we do need to talk about that. So the first 10 tablets talk about the adventures of Gilgamesh and Enkidu and their search for immortality. In the 11th tablet, if you just want to focus on the 11th tablet, Gilgamesh meets a person named Utnapishtim, who's been called the Babylonian Noah. So beyond the waters of death, he encounters Utnapishtim. Another name for him is Atrahasis. So we have another creation flood account that's been discovered in cuneiform script. It's called Atrahasis. So according to Utnapishtim, the god Ea warned him that a flood was coming and that he should build a boat. O man of Shurapak, son of Ubar-Tutu, tear down your house and build a ship. Abandon wealth, seek after life, scorn possessions, and save your life. Bring up the seed of all kinds of living things into the ship which you shall build, and let its dimensions be well measured. So he was to build a boat, but it was to be 120 cubits square, 7 stories high, covered with bitumen, loaded with food, gold, silver, his family, craftsmen, and animals. So guess how long was the storm? Not 40 days and 40 nights, 6 days and 6 nights. And the boat was grounded on a mountain. A dove was sent out, then a swallow, and finally a raven. The ark landed on a mountain, which just happens to be 300 miles from Mount Ararat. And so when Utnapishtim came out of the ark, he offered sacrifices. It says around which the gods flocked like flies because they were hungry. Utnapishtim was given eternal life as a gift from the gods as a result. All right, so there's a lot of similarities between Gilgamesh and Genesis. So the flood was planned by the gods. Utnapishtim is the 10th antediluvian king. It's interesting, Noah is the 10th patriarch from Adam. In each account, the hero gets a warning before the flood. In each account, the family of the hero is saved. You have different kinds of animals on the boat. You have a boat with decks sealed with bitumen. The flood comes because of rain. People perish outside the boat. Birds, including dove and raven, are sent out. The boat is grounded on a mountain, and a sacrifice is offered by a hero coming out of the boat. A lot of similarities between Gilgamesh and Genesis. Of course, there are a lot of differences too. So why does God send the global flood? Well, we just learned it was because of violence, moral corruption. But no moral cause is given for the flood in Gilgamesh epic. So the gods capriciously decide to destroy all people. In the Bible, God is sovereign, sends the global flood. But in the Gilgamesh epic, there are many gods, polytheistic. They're not in control. In fact, we're told the gods were terror-stricken at the deluge. So in Genesis, the ark has 3 decks. In Gilgamesh epic, the boat has 7 decks. And the ark of Genesis is shaped like a barge, but the ark in the Gilgamesh epic is shaped like a cube, which would make it really impossible to survive in a flood situation. Of course, in Genesis, it rained 40 days and 40 nights. We saw Noah and his family on the ark for 371 days. But in the Gilgamesh epic, the flood only lasts 7 days. And in Genesis, he sends out a raven and then he sends out the dove. But in the Gilgamesh epic, the Pashtim sends a dove and then a swallow, finally a raven. In Genesis, Noah offers sacrifice that pleases the Lord. And in the Gilgamesh epic, the Pashtim offers a sacrifice that says, the gods smelled the savor, the gods gathered round like flies after the sacrifice. Why was that? Because the gods were hungry. They didn't have any food for a period of time. They were starved. So the question, did Moses use Gilgamesh to write Genesis? We'll talk more about Eric von Daniken and his book, The Chariots of the Gods. We'll talk about ancient aliens in 2 weeks. So he says, if we work on the hypothesis that the Epic of Gilgamesh came to Egypt from the Sumerians by way of the Assyrians and Babylonians, that's quite an assumption. The young Moses found it there and adapted it to his own ends. Then the Sumerian story of the flood, not the biblical one, would be the genuine account. So what do you say to Eric von Daniken? What's the problem with that view? Does the fact that Gilgamesh epic is older than Genesis flood mean that the older the account, the truer the account?
No.
Why not?
The differences are we cannot reconcile them. It's a big difference between them.
What do the similarities show us?
That's based in reality. One was grossly manipulated, distorted. It's just been basically made into a myth, but it's based on reality or original account. But just because the Gilgamesh epic has been recorded, written down chronologically earlier, does not mean that's what happened, because even in the Gilgamesh epic, it's recording a tale that it has heard from a previous account, and that historically goes back to pre-Sumerian culture, which means pre-Tower of Babel, which means the events of the flood been recorded way earlier. It's just that Moses's account in the Torah was recorded chronologically later, but it's more factually accurate.
Yeah, that's what we believe. We believe that it's because of the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So, yes, the similarities show that there is a true history. The flood was real. But as far as the telling of the story and the details of the story, we see a distinction between Genesis and Gilgamesh. And we recognize that only one of those 2 stories can be true. And as you look at how a 7-story boat, that's ridiculous that it would be able to float being a cube. And secondly, how could there be a flood in 7 days? That is impossible too. So there's things in the account that show that it must not be true. So only one can be true, but I think the similarities show that there's a common historical core there. All right, so to finish tonight, we've talked about planet Earth. We talked about creation. We talked about the third day of creation. We talked about the basement rocks, the schist and the granite that probably were the creation rocks in the Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon was not formed by God. It's formed as a result of a judgment of God. And the fossils in the Grand Canyon would be post-fall. And we believe that the sedimentary rocks with the fossils, including the trilobites, we saw the trilobite graveyard, would be a result of the flood. Not only that, but the layers of the Grand Canyon were laid down over a short period of time by rushing water. And the flat surface of the Great Unconformity, and as well as the flat surface of the desert around the Grand Canyon, shows the sweeping flood waters swept everything away. Probably a post-flood lake had a breaching event that scoured out the Grand Canyon. So we learned that God sent the flood because of moral corruption, and the application as we live in the days of Noah is that we would walk with the Lord as Noah did in those last days. We know that after the millennium, God is going to destroy the world with fire. 2 Peter 3:10. And God will create a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. 2 Peter 3:13. Revelation 21:1, the new earth will not have any oceans or seas. And the city of New Jerusalem will be on the new earth in the eternal state. So today, as we go to the Grand Canyon, we're reminded that a holy God judges sin in the world. The Grand Canyon is a huge chasm. The Bible tells us that sin separates a sinner from God like a huge canyon. And yet, because of Jesus Christ, we can have a way to God and a relationship with Him. And the cross is the bridge to life, as through faith alone in Christ alone, we can cross over and be forgiven of our sins and obtain eternal life.
Amen.
Let's pray. Father, thank you that your word is true. And as we study geology, as we look at the rocks, the fossils, so many people are fascinated by, we know that they tell a story. And we know that that story relates to your word, because everything that we see in this world tells us that you are creator and you are judge and you are king, you are sovereign. Thank you for the salvation we have in Christ. Bless these students. Give us a wonderful Thanksgiving time to reflect back over all that you've done for us this last year. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 Thank you.
Everybody have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I'll see you in a couple weeks.
You
You do
too,
the
Dr.
same.
G.
Thank
Happy
you.
Thanksgiving,
Thank you.
everybody.
Happy
Angie.
Thanksgiving.
Thank you,
All right.
John.
Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Happy
All right.
Thanksgiving.
Bye,
Thank you.
guys.
Bye. Bye.